Hello and welcome back to Vinyl Friday, where I go through my records like a big nerd and talk about why I love them. And love them I do. Today's episode is a classic album. I put it to a poll last week and this is the album that won. Today's artist has won 25 Grammys and 1 Oscar. He is the only artist ever to win 3 consecutive Album of the Year Grammys. He's in the following halls of fame: R&B, rock and roll, songwriters. He has won the Presidential Medal of Freedom, Rolling Stone's Greatest Albums of All Times lists, all of the different iterations. His songs pepper Rolling Stone's Greatest Songs of All Times lists. And the album that we're going to be listening to today is the first album to debut at #1 by an American artist, and the third overall. This is because Elton John nabbed the title the first and second times. Hi buddy, how's it going? Today's artist is Stevie Wonder, and the album we will be listening to is Songs in the Key of Life. Today we're going to break down who this Stevie Wonder character is anyway. We're going to look at the history of this album, how it came to be, and then we're going to ask ourselves the question, does this album prove that Stevie Wonder is a genius? Are you ready? I am ready. Let's go. Stevie Wonder was a kid who picked up instruments from a very early age.
I started playing harmonica and piano when I was 4, and then when I was 8, bongo, drum, and organ.
He sang in the church. He was a soloist by the age of 8, and somewhere around age 11 he was signed to Motown as a kind of child prodigy. And it was there that he was christened with the stage name Little Stevie Wonder. I know it may come as a shock to some of you that Wonder was not his mother's maiden name. In his early adolescence, he had a big hit with the song Fingertips. Clap your hands just a little bit louder. And then throughout the rest of the 60s, he achieved moderate success with a string of hit singles. Here's a highlight reel. Baby, everything is alright. Uptight, there's a place in the sun where there's hey, hey, hey. She's watching my life. I am so my shady mama, pretty little yes to me, yes to you. He also co-wrote the songs Tears of a Clown for Smokey Robinson. Tears of a Clown. And It's a Shame for the Spinners. It's a shame. When he hit 21, the child contract that he had with Motown expired. He let it lapse, and it ushered in a period of unfettered creativity for the young man. He renegotiated his contract and ended up with something in which he had much more control over the production of his records. He put out a string of albums over the next few years, including in 1972, Music of My Mind, a fantastic album, and Talking Book in 1973, Inner Visions in 1974. This is a mouthful. Fulfillingness's first finale. Here's another highlight reel. You are the sunshine of my life. Very superstitious. Been just enough till I reach my cry. Don't you worry about a thing. He was picking up a string of Grammys along the way. So it's now early 1975. Stevie is dissatisfied with the way that the government is running the show, and I would assume he was probably under some degree of pressure because he had been churning out these hits for years. He announces to the world, I am done with music, I will do music no more, it is over. I am moving to Ghana, and I am helping children with disabilities. But he was halfway through planning his farewell tour when he suddenly changed his mind, negotiated a new contract with Motown. It was a 7-year, 7 LP contract, and it was $37 million, which in today's dollars is about $200 million. And it was the biggest artist contract to date. Huge, I say. He signs this contract and immediately takes a year off. Good for you, Stevie. Good for you. 1975 was the first year since he was 16 that he didn't put an album out. A point that Paul Simon notes when he accepts his Album of the Year Grammy for Still Crazy After All These Years.
Most of all, I like to thank Stevie Wonder, who didn't make an album this year. So.
Motown's getting pretty nervous by this point because they've just paid him an awful lot of money and they're not really seeing any of the fruits of that. So they're harassing him constantly. When are you going to finish this album, Stevie? We need your money. But see, the thing is, by this point, Stevie is in the studio and he is working his butt off on the next project. He is barely eating. He is barely sleeping. He's calling in his session musicians at any hour of the day or night when inspiration strikes. And because he is facing constant harassment from Motown, he has a set of shirts printed that read, "We're almost finished." And the album that we end up with in September of 1976 is now considered to be the pinnacle of Mr. Stevie Wonder's career. It is a sprawling, ambitious, double-and-a-half album. It is songs in the key of life. There are 130 people in the credits of this. I had to look this up, though, because this copy of the album that I have, regrettably, came without any liner notes. It also came without the 7-inch EP that accompanied the double. But on the plus side, I think 18-year-old me probably only paid about $4 for it, so it's a trade-off. I have to read the liner notes on the internet. It's okay. What was I saying? I totally interrupted myself. 130 people in the credits, including, but not limited to, George Benson, Minnie Riperton, Ripperton, I don't know how it's pronounced, Denise Williams, and perhaps most impressively, Herbie Hancock on the track As, which we are going to break down right now. Oh, this is a good one. I'm really excited about this song. We're just going to go through from the beginning to the end. I'm not going to break it down into the individual instruments because there's just so much to say about this. So, from the top, we're hit in the face with these jazz chords. Courtesy of Stevie Wonder, nay Stevie Hardaway Morris, and also jazz maestro Herbie Hancock. Jazz is in Stevie's DNA. His early albums are quite jazzy, a lot of them are primarily instrumental. To the sunny side of the street. And this album actually has a song, an incredible song, that is a tribute to these early jazz pioneers. Here are some of music's pioneers that time will not allow us to forget, etc. We're getting some really tasty jazz licks right off the top, right off the bat. We've got this lovely, light, breezy verse. Hello, hello! This is gonna be a fun one. So stripped back, these are the introduction / verse chords in their most basic form. If we wanted to go a little bit spicier, sort of rock and roll level spicy, we would add some sevenths and they'd sound like this. But because Stevie is a jazzy man, he takes it one step further and adds a couple of extra notes to the extra notes, and it sounds like this. It's those little touches that make it so special. That's a long way from that's God tier / jazz. That's just jazz. And that is why we chord girlies love our jazz. Rosebuds know the bloom in early May. Oh. Light, breezy, airy, sweet. The end of the verse, though, hints at the direction that the chorus is going to go in. That I'll be loving you always. Those last 4 chords at the end, oh, lovely jazz turnaround. the sort of thing that you would find in jazz standards. It's used to transition between parts of the song, so A part, B part, etc. It's something that Paul McCartney uses a lot in his more traditional sounding songs. Arguably, will it Beatles? Yes, it will. If you're interested in hearing more about that, you can watch this episode on Here, There, and Everywhere. But back to Stevie. Oh, I've got a Will It Beatles. He actually did a duet with Paul McCartney on Tug of War. Will it Beatles? Yes, it will. Now, I think the songwriting of this track is immaculate. It really rides on these dramatic, explosive contrasts, right? So the verse is this lovely, sweet, light, airy thing, major key. The chorus is a much weightier, funkier, minor key affair. And then the middle eight, and we are going to come to these things in our time, but the middle eight is in the same vein as the verse, but it adds something new. It brings something fresh to the song. Okay, I think we're up to the chorus now. You know the chorus is coming because the drums and the bass pick up. Drums. A couple of important changes to point out here. One, the drums come in full force. Bam! Right in your face. The bass goes from a very sort of hands-off approach, very only the necessaries, to this lovely pumping octave. Boom ba boom ba boom ba boom ba. That was probably not nice to listen to, so we'll get the piano correspondent to demonstrate. We're getting the piano correspondent and not the bass correspondent because so much of what's happening in the bass on this album is being played by Stevie or being underscored by Stevie on this massive keyboard machine that he was playing. It's how you get this incredible one-man band sound of this album, which we will come back to. Piano correspondent! And the electric piano, which is gentle in the verses of the song, becomes this sort of rhythmic, stabby powerhouse. And those stabs make it really funky, which is what the verse lacks. Again, there's that contrast. Interestingly, this is very similar to the stab pattern that's used by the saxophones in Sir Duke, which we mentioned earlier. The end of this chorus has this delicious chord. Jazz! It's those four chords for most of the chorus. Except, psych, going into the middle eight, that last chord changes. It goes... What? How cool is that? Not only is that a neat chord, the backing vocals are singing something that clashes entirely with that chord. This is the chord, and this is what the backing vocals are doing. Which sounds awful, but then they resolve to this. Through the chorus, this is what the backing vocals are doing. Pretty great. But then the last time, here it comes. Oh! Dissonance. Resolution. It's what we all crave in our lives and in our music. Also, the entire chorus is comprised of a call and response. The backing vocals call, Stevie responds. I love that it is harmonized. I really feel like that minor chord sequence holds and conveys the weightiness of this lyrical concept of the song, of permanence, of always. Boom! Always. And just like that, we're carried into the middle eight. Did you know that True Love asks for nothing? I love his vocals on this line in particular. To last forever, another day. I love how when he sings the line forever, his vocals dip down a little bit, but he never actually cuts them. He brings them back in again. Forever, another day. Like this. He does it better than I do. To last forever, another day. That's lovely. Now we come to our last verse. What he does here I find really interesting. He's really drawing from his gospel roots on this one. He really shows off his vocal agility from this point in the song onwards. Prior to this, he has a lovely voice, we get to hear it, but here he starts to play with the melody that he's established. He doesn't need to sing it the same way again because we already know what it sounds like. Now he can be like, here's what I can do. And boy, does he do. That sort of improvisatory approach is, again, a little bit jazz and a lot gospel. Here are some of my favorite phrases. Oh, isn't that delicious? I've been loving you always. Again. I've been loving you always. And this one. Always. Oh, and that ride cymbal coming in. Oh. Before we really jump into that last chorus, though, we will get there. But before we jump into it, I would like to point out how the backing vocals open up that last verse and guide us into the chorus. We haven't had the backing vocals do this earlier in the song during the verse. Today I know I'm living by tomorrow. We've got an and then here. And from here, it just gets bigger and bigger. I'll be loving you forever. With this call and response thing, there's a real history behind this, and that history is Africa. This time for Africa. You find it in basically every genre of music that has derived from something African. We're not going to get into how that African music got to the States today because it is a bummer, let me tell you. But you find it in blues, you find it in gospel, you find it in Afro-Cuban music, you find it in R&B. From there it makes its way into early rock and roll, rap, etc. And what he's doing here is very typical of that style where the call establishes the melody of the song and then his response is an improvisation. I especially like his display of agility on this phrase. Well, I can't do that. Then we've got a keys solo, and there are some beautiful moments of dissonance during the solo. Here's one now. That little trill there, those notes don't technically belong within that key, but Herbie, I assume, put them there. Sounds great. Lovely. I think Miles Davis said something about how there are no wrong notes. It's about what note comes after the wrong note. And that's a beautiful display of that concept. Thanks, Herbie. We've got some backing vocals that come in, and this is where it sort of becomes a coda, an extended vamp on the musical themes introduced by the chorus. I love these these harmonized which we get a little of in the last verse. And then he puts on this unusual voice, which recalls a sort of sermon. The song becomes a sermon to the infinity of his love. Our children, grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren will tell. There's also this little ad-lib that he does about 5.5 minutes into the song. The note choice is just exquisite. For the nerds out there among us, he's highlighting, I think, the 6th and the 7th notes of this minor scale. But, you know, let's talk about it in terms of feelings. It feels great. Look at that, I nailed it. That's the exact spot. Right there, 5.5 minutes. Beautiful. You want it again? I want it again. Here are some more of my favorite phrases. That one's lovely. Oh, that's a good one too. That's really beautiful. And then what follows is basically the world's longest fade out, which I think really drives home that notion of infinity, of always. Just keeps going on. I mean, to the point where he stopped ad-libbing and the backing vocalists are still going. One more of these. That's the last we hear of Stevie. And the backing vocalists just keep going. Just keep going on that round and round with that lyrical roundabout as the song fades out. They may still be going to this day. We'll never know. Now, I bought this album when I was 18, as I mentioned earlier, and I hadn't listened to it for a while before I had to give it a listen for this, in preparation for this episode, and I realized that I had misremembered a lot of the sound of the album. I had thought that it was this massive orchestral production with huge bands, and while a lot of the songs have horn sections, that kind of thing, actually quite a lot of that big sound is coming from Stevie's keyboard. It makes a lot of different sounds. Like if you listen to the strings on Village Ghetto Land, that's Stevie's keyboard. It honks and it squeals and it sings and it screeches. It's all keyboards, and he layers them upon layers upon layers upon layers until it sounds like a really big track with lots of musicians on it. And I will concede there are a lot of musicians on this album, but in spite of that, so much of what defines the sound and the feel of this album is Stevie's keyboard. Although so many of the songs on this album are diverse and varied, it is that keyboard, it is Stevie's playing that brings it all together and creates this cohesion. It is undeniably Stevie, and it sounds like nothing else that was happening at the time. This is another thing I had to remind myself of, because the first time I listened to this album, I had the privilege of access to everything that came after it. I often have people who come into the comments and say, you're too young to appreciate this music, you weren't there when it came out, you don't understand it in context. And on the one hand, they're right. I don't have the first-hand experience of 1976, of September 1976. I was not there. I don't know what that's like. However, I can situate this in terms of what came after and what it influenced. That's a benefit that first-time listeners don't get. And in any case, music is timeless. If it were true that you could only listen to music when it came out, then none of us would be listening to Beethoven. Anyway, my point is that I did have to go back and have a listen to what else was happening musically in 1976 by his peers, by his contemporaries, in other genres, and you can really hear how this is a totally different animal, how there's nothing like this, how people would have listened to this and gone, holy crap, what is that? Right, so this brings us to our overarching question: does this album prove that Stevie Wonder is a genius? Here's the thing. Genius is not an officially defined term by any stretch of the imagination. It is entirely subjective. So before we get into it, I think we need to define our terms. Here is my best go at defining musical genius. I think that the individual needs to be able to create something novel. Even if it is influenced by other musics, it needs to sound separate from or different than that music. All music is derivative, all art is derivative, but the individual needs to be able to produce something that has never been heard before. That's the first one. 2, genius is not the same as virtuosity. They will probably be able to find their way around multiple instruments, but it's not necessarily because they are driven to master the instruments, which takes us to number 3. This individual works as if guided by some external force and is driven by a sort of compulsion to realize a fully formed idea that is in their heads. And they will work tirelessly until that finished product matches what they can hear in their heads. They will often sacrifice everything in service of this project. 4, they need to be adaptive, flexible, so even if they have this fully formed idea, they have this sort of elastic creativity that allows them to play with the idea that they have. And that helps them to achieve what they want in the end. And the last one is almost a sort of bonus. They need to be able to take all of that and create something that is accessible, that people will enjoy listening to. It's not necessary, but it is a nice additional extra, right? Good. Okay, so let's assess Stevie and Songs in the Key of Life according to these criteria. 1, does Stevie create with this album something novel, something no one's ever heard before? I would argue yes. I think that this album would have sounded incredibly alien, as I mentioned earlier, when it came out on the scene. He's got that keyboard thing going on. Obviously his influences you can hear are gospel and jazz and funk and even a little bit of rock. But this is not a gospel album, a jazz album, a funk album, or a rock album. It is a Stevie album. Undeniably. Number 2, the virtuosity instrumentalism thing. On this album, I think Stevie plays a range of keyboards, harmonica, and drums. I think he plays drums on this one. Anyway, he is very good at those instruments, but he is not a virtuoso necessarily. There are tracks like Contusion, where he couldn't play the keyboard part and had to hire a keyboardist to come in and play. But he did that because he was driven to create this final perfect project. Which takes us to number 3. Stevie absolutely worked on this album like a man possessed, compelled to finish, sacrificing eating and sleeping. His bassist on I Wish recalled working all day in the studio, getting home at 3 a.m. and the phone rings and it's Stevie saying, "Hey, can you come back in? I've got some ideas I want to work on." He is quoted as saying, "If my flow is going, I keep on until I peak." He works and works and works until he's done. It's part of the reason that this album was so delayed. He was a perfectionist. He wanted it to be perfect before he released it into the world. There was no, that'll do with Stevie Wonder. This man had an idea of what he wanted things to sound like, and he wanted to produce them so that they sounded exactly as he needed them to. And he knew when he'd achieved this. 4, I would argue that he was adaptive and playful and that his creativity was elastic on this recording. He spent over a year trying things out until he got it right. And 5, is his music accessible? Well, this is one of the most influential albums of all time. Michael Jackson and George Michael name it as their favorite album of all time. Whitney Houston says that her singing was largely inspired by this album. The drummer from Mastodon says that his playing was inspired by the playing on this album. And I'd like to close with a quote of Elton John's, if you'll permit me. Elton John says, "Let me put it this way. Wherever I go in the world, I always take a copy of Songs in the Key of Life. For me, it's the best album ever made, and I'm always left in awe after I listen to it." And frankly, who are we to argue with Elton John, right? I tried to think of other examples of artists who fit this criteria, and I've come up with Frank Zappa, Paul McCartney, Michael Jackson, Miles Davis, definitely Brian Wilson, Joni Mitchell. As a quick aside, you'll notice that there's only one woman on this list. And I think obviously part of it is that in that sort of heyday of albums and classic rock, women were not, I would argue, empowered to participate in the music industry in the same capacity as the men were. I talked to one of my bandmates yesterday about like why it is that we don't see women as geniuses, that there are all these male geniuses, but we don't really have that many examples of women that might fit this criteria. And she said that she thinks it's because of the way that women are socialized, that the sort of behavior that was enabled by Stevie Wonder, by Marvin Gaye, by Lindsey Buckingham in the studio, of demanding things of people, of calling people at 3 o'clock in the morning and making them stay until 5 a.m., that women are more reluctant to do that kind of thing because we're not socialized to be pushy in that way. And in fact, Joni Mitchell, who is on that list, was often put down for how ballsy and how bossy and pushy she was as an artist. But I think she was driven by the same thing as all those other artists. She was motivated by her creative vision. She was driven and compelled. And that's it. If you enjoyed this episode or you would like to support any of the weird things I do, I will leave a link in the description to my Buy Me a Coffee page where you are most welcome to make a donation. But no pressure, friends. Thank you so much to everybody who has signed up as a member or made a donation. I appreciate you so very much. If you're curious about what any of my original music sounds like, I'll leave a link to that in the description as well. Otherwise, thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you here next week. Have a great weekend! The one nice thing about long hair is this, right here. That's the only nice thing in my experience. That, right there.